Hello, I'm Dr. Ken Landau. Thanks for watching. Let's talk about chlorine gas. Chlorine is one of the top 10 compounds manufactured here in the United States. We make about 15 million tons every year. The rest of the world, about 45 million tons. It's manufactured in fewer than 20 states, which means it has to be transported, typically by train or by truck. And it's done through relatively highly populated areas, and unfortunately with relatively minimal security. It's relatively easy to manufacture chlorine gas. One takes a brine of salt and then adds some electric current. The chlorine gas itself is a yellowish green product at room temperature that's irritating and pungent. It has a smell that's a combination of, most people would say, pineapple and pepper. But if the gas is exposed to extreme cold, less than 30 degrees Fahrenheit, or at significant pressure, it turns into a liquid. Happens to be a clear amber-colored liquid, and that's the way it's stored. And it's also transported that way as a liquid in steel canisters. Now, it's non-flammable, but it's potentially explosive, especially when it's in contact with other kinds of chemicals, certain acids or turpentine or ammonia. The chemical itself, the chlorine, is indispensable. We use it all the time as a commercial bleach, as a household bleach. It's used for the sanitation of wastes and sewage. It's also used as a disinfectant for our drinking water and for our swimming pools, but it's used in a lot of industries. So for instance, it's used in the manufacture of cloth and paper and plastics and pesticides. It's used in synthetic rubbers and solvents and a variety of chemical products. It's used in refrigerants and PVC production. It's also used in pharmaceuticals and in cosmetics. Toxicity seems to relate mostly to either industrial or occupational areas. Sometimes, unfortunately, some acid is added to it. That increases the potential for problems. Accidental spills offloading from railroads, and of course deliberate poisoning. Now, each year about 6,000 cases are reported to poison control centers. Typically in the home setting, it occurs when someone's cleaning a toilet bowl and adds an additional acid cleanser. Chlorine gas, when it's released, harms the individual exposed, but typically can't be passed to others. So a person who has chlorine gas toxicity is not really significantly likely to cause problems to a rescuer, except if the chlorine happens to be a liquid. Now, OSHA sets a limit of 1 part per million. They say if there are more than 10 parts per million, it's dangerous to your health, and you should immediately leave the area. Now, fortunately, chlorine gas has a pungent odor, so you know it's there even at a concentration as low as 0.1 to 0.3 parts per million. It irritates the mucous membranes a little bit. At 1 to 3 parts per million, if you're around it for a long enough period of time, say about an hour, but at a concentration of just 5 to 15 parts per million, it can be a significant irritant to the eyes and the nose, and it'll cause a cough. And this is the area that typically is where exposures occur at home. Now, a little bit higher, more likely industrial, at more than 30 parts per million, that's when significant respiratory distress and chest pain and shortness of breath and cough and airway constriction occur. You can even cough up blood. At 50 parts per million, fluid accumulates in your lung. We call it pulmonary edema. And then major toxicity at more than 400 parts per million, that would cause death within 30 minutes. And at an exposure of 800 to 1,000 parts per million, as we would get in warfare, that's fatal within just several minutes. It's important to realize that chlorine gas is heavier than air, so it sinks to the floor. So if there's any question about exposure, you don't want to drop. You don't want to be on the floor. And interestingly, that means that children are at higher risk because they're shorter, typically, and We know that if you look at the lung surface area to the body weight, look at the ratio, it's considerably greater in a child, as is the minute respiration, minute volume of respiration. The airways are also smaller. Well, it isn't the chlorine gas itself that causes the problem, but the chlorine gas, when it combines with water, leads to production of hydrochloric acid and bleach, which is called hypochlorous acid, and that also can degenerate into reactive oxygen species that are formed. And those are highly reactive with the tissue. So we have the reactive oxygen species and we have the acids that form, both of which attack the tissues and can cause death to cells. Well, obviously, your mucous membranes put you at relatively high risk. So areas where there's fluid, the eyes and the nose and the throat and the lungs. It's also important to realize that chlorine gas isn't really highly water soluble, so it tends not to go too deeply into the lung tissue. It doesn't affect the small alveoli where the oxygen passage occurs, and as a result, once you're cured of the injury, as long as it's not too severe, then chances are you're going to be good. Now, what are the symptoms? Well, the symptoms vary with exposure and a variety of other factors, but it typically is a respiratory irritant. So it's going to cause some burning in the nose and the throat, which can result in pharyngitis and laryngitis. And then there's coughing and sneezing and wheezing and difficulty breathing and chest tightness and shortness of breath, depending on the time and the exposure. If it's high enough exposure, develop pulmonary edema, where fluid starts to accumulate in the lung. It can accumulate at a rate of about 1 quart an hour if there's significant exposure, and that can take significant volume away from the blood, so that means there isn't enough blood to circulate oxygen to the tissues. And that can cause hypotension, the blood pressure falls, and ultimately it can lead to cardiovascular collapse. It's also bad for the eyes. Remember, another surface covered by liquid. So it can cause blinking and burning discomfort and reddening of the eyes and conjunctivitis and tearing and involuntary closure of the lids, and sometimes it causes blurred vision and corneal burns or corneal ulcers. It actually is an acid eye injury. The skin gets off relatively easily because the skin isn't moist. However, if exposure is to liquid chlorine is 30 degrees below zero. So that can lead to frostbite-like injury. And anyone exposed to a significant amount of chlorine gas is going to have some non-specific symptoms, non-specific like nausea and vomiting and headache and disorientation, and the heart rate is going to go up, and early enough, the blood pressure will go up. Later, unfortunately, both collapse. Now, that's acute exposure. Chronic exposure, if you work around it all the time and you're exposed to more than you should be, then you can develop some dental erosion from the acids that are produced. A skin problem that looks like acne, we call it chloracne, a runny nose, salivation, decreased exercise tolerance. The toxicity is going to depend on your individual susceptibility. So young people and old people are both at higher risk. We also find risk in those people who have something wrong with their lungs. So people who have a history of asthma or chronic obstructive lung disease, smokers, or even ex-smokers are at higher risk. You can be genetically susceptible or resistant to some degree of exposure. And if you happen to be exercising at a time of exposure, you're breathing in more. Obviously, that increases the risk of toxicity. Also, it's important to know the duration of exposure, if it's extremely brief, or is the gas concentrated? If it's highly concentrated, obviously we have more of a significant problem. But for the most part, people with mild to moderate exposure, the kind that's the accident, the kind that's not wartime, or not industrial major problem, well, those people are going to get better very shortly. They don't need any care. They're going to get better within 2, 3, 4 days. Sometimes it can leave a residual problem with the lung, especially in people who either were smokers or had pre-existing lung disease. It actually can cause chemical irritant type induced asthma, used to be called reactive airway dysfunction syndrome. And only rarely does it get low enough into the lung that can actually lead to emphysema or pulmonary fibrosis. If you're exposed or think you're exposed, obviously leave the area. If You have some eye irritation, rinse the eyes with plain tap water. If you have contact lenses, get them out. Go to a higher ground. Some people need medical therapy. If the exposure is significant enough, then you might need some oxygen. If it's very severe exposure, then you might need intubation and then assisted ventilation. Most people don't need any of that. Sometimes if there's bronchospasm, if you're especially susceptible, you can use the same kind of medicines that we use to treat asthma, the albuterol or the Ventolin or some inhaled steroids, even injected steroids, especially within the first half hour. We can nebulize sodium bicarbonate, since that can neutralize any of the acid. We can use some antioxidants. There's also the possibility of nebulized lidocaine, the same thing you get at the dentist's office. That can soothe the bronchial tubes. And if there's a lot of edema, a lot of fluid that's being produced inside the respiratory tract, we can use a drying agent. Again, the type that we use in asthma, an anticholinergic called Atrovent. Now, there's a differential diagnosis. So if a person seems that maybe they've been exposed, but it hasn't been an industrial accident, we know it's not a war-related issue, then we have to consider, well, is it chlorine gas, is it phosgene gas, or any of those other gases, or more likely, is it tear gas or CS gas? Causes basically the same kind of symptoms with tearing and burning sensation in the eyes and the upper airway. Doesn't affect the skin, but doesn't cause any pulmonary edema. Then there's the issue, well, maybe it's VX or sarin or Novichok. That was what was used recently in Salisbury, England. Has the same sort of symptoms as chlorine gas toxicity, but in addition, it has muscle twitchiness and paralysis and narrowed pupils. There are also the possibility of certain medical diseases, asthma, viral pneumonia, smoke inhalation injuries, or clots in the lung, blood clots, called pulmonary emboli, maybe carbon monoxide toxicity. Well, in wartime, it was first thought of, interestingly enough, by a school teacher from New York City who thought in 1862 that the Union Army should weaponize chlorine gas, take a 10-inch shell and put half of the shell filled with explosive and the other half with chlorine gas and shoot it off against the Confederate soldiers. That never got very far. Well, in Germany, during the latter part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s, they were the leaders in the world in chemistry, and one of their chemists, Fritz Haber, came up with the idea of weaponizing in World War I the chlorine gas. He tried to get the German high command to believe in it, but they kept turning him down. Well, realizing that the chlorine gas would sink to the ground, and World War I was a war of trenches. Men were in 400 miles of trenches, the Germans versus the Allies, with the no man's land in between. Well, if they could use the chlorine gas, they could get the guys to come out of the bunkers. Well, after about 6 months of the war, Fritz Haber convinced one of the local generals to allow him to try it, and he put about 6,000 canisters along the line where the German soldiers were, and then he waited. He waited until there was a sufficient amount of wind that was blowing in the right direction, of course, through the no man's land into the British and French trenches. And what happened is that on the day of April 22nd of 2015, they released about 160 tons of the gas within a period of about 10 minutes. It wafted over the no man's land into the French and Algerian line, and within moments it killed 1,100 soldiers and injured 4,000 more. And within several weeks they used the gas 5 more times. And during the course of World War I, they used the gas and others multiple times, innumerable times. Actually, they used 50 different gases and invented or discovered 3,000 total. Well, the British did the same thing. but they started after a lag period of several months. They didn't start until September of 2015. And the gas exposure, or at least the thought that there was gas, was a nightly occurrence with whistles and all clear signals several times a night, not infrequent. So they developed some gas masks, and it was such a common occurrence that they developed the gas masks not only for the people, but also for the horses and the dogs and even the messenger pigeons. Well, what caused more damage in World War I? Was it the use of chemical weapons, or was it the use of artillery shells and bullets? Well, actually, 9 to 10 million people died during World War I, and fewer than 1%, or less than 90,000, died because of chemical weapons. So if you want to say what was worse during World War I, certainly it was the explosives. Well, subsequently, as everyone knows, the chlorine gas has been used multiple times in the Iraqi conflict and in Syria. It's actually been used 50 times in Syria by the government against its own people. On 2 of those occasions, America sent bombers to go and destroy some of the facilities that supposedly had been destroyed by the Syrians long ago, but really wasn't. Well, we still have a significant number of accidents occurring every year or so, actually more than 200 occurrences since World War I, typically involving railroad cars or trucks. They've injured a significant number of people, killed relatively few people, but the fear is that the terrorists can have access to trains or trucks or storage tanks. And in today's society, almost anything is possible, so it's a good idea to know something about the signs and symptoms and what to do if you're exposed to chlorine gas. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Ken Landau.